Mixed martial arts is a comparatively new sport that blends techniques and elements from different types of fighting. I'm talking about karate and boxing and wrestling and all these others rolled into one to create this intense hybrid sport that has proven to be popular. The biggest and most notable MMA promotion in the world, by far the one where all the best fighters compete, is the Ultimate Fighting Championship. The UFC is easily among the biggest success stories in sports over the past few decades. Consider that in 2001 it was sold for a modest $2 million. Can you even imagine buying the UFC for $2 million? It was in bad shape, believed to be approaching bankruptcy with a terrible reputation, and in reality, a lot of people were saying that $2 million was paying way too much for it. Yeah, however, in 2016, when it was sold again, the new sale price was $4 billion, meaning it became 2,000 times more valuable over the course of 15 years. A return on investment that is almost unheard of, and to take it even a step further, in 2023, it merged with the WWE to create a combined company valued at over $21 billion. The UFC is transformed from a struggling gimmick into a legitimate multi-billion-dollar organization. It is an impressive story, so in this video, I want to talk about the rise, fall, and rise again of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. UFC 1, the first ever event, was held on November 12, 1993 as a pay-per-view event where fighters of different styles were invited to compete against each other in a single elimination tournament. The fights were held in a fenced-in octagon without corners, and the only rules were that you couldn't hit the other person in the groin, gouge their eyes, or bite them. Other than that, everything was allowed. In short, members of the Gracie family, known for pioneering Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, teamed up with an ad executive named Arthur Davey to create the concept. They found a bunch of investors, pitched the idea to Semaphore Entertainment Group, known for hosting pay-per-view events, and that is how it started. The whole idea of it was based on the theoretical questions of what would happen if people of different fighting backgrounds were to fight each other. It's like when you're hanging out with your friends and someone says, "Hey, who do you think would win in a fight, a wrestler or a boxer?" And then you sit there for the next 10 minutes talking about how that fight would play out. Well, basically, that is how the UFC started. They figured people would be entertained and curious about these unusual matchups. That first event was bought by over 85,000 people, making it successful enough for them to keep doing it. By UFC 5, about a year and a half later, their numbers had tripled, and Semaphore Entertainment Group bought full ownership of the brand from the original creators. UFC was gaining popularity as this wild, no-holds-barred, anything-goes type of promotion, which, as you might expect, was new and exciting. However, there were a lot of issues forming that quickly caused a major decline in the business. I put together a list of factors behind it, but most of it stems from the fact that UFC seemed like it was so dangerous. There are two parts to this. For one, they really should have some degree of regulation, right? You can't just put two people together in a cage and allow them to do anything to each other. That's not safe. People were getting kicked in the face while they were on the ground. Teeth were flying across the room. Literally, there was a match at UFC 3 with a 400-pound weight difference between the opponents. The American Medical Association wanted it to be banned, so a very real safety concern in those early matches. And the other part of it was that UFC was embracing those safety concerns, making it seem even more dangerous than it actually was. Yeah, the UFC was wild in those early days, and that dangerous reputation that helped establish them in the first place quickly started to hurt them. In 1996, John McCain, a senator from Arizona, actively started fighting against it. After seeing a tape of one of the events, he called it barbaric, said it wasn't a sport, and used the phrase human cockfighting to describe it, which became a popular phrase among people protesting it. He had influence over the cable companies like Time Warner, who decided to stop offering the pay-per-view events, meaning most people around the country could not buy a UFC fight even if they wanted to. He sent letters to all of the governors in the country asking them to ban UFC fighting in their state, which did end up happening in most of them. All of these factors caused their viewership to fall to about 5% of what it once was. To finish up my list here, UFC was viewed by the public as a gimmick, which honestly was a discouraging time for them because they were working to to legitimize it, slowly adding more rules to the fights, like making gloves mandatory, setting time limits, weight classes. I don't want to get too specific, but UFC 20 did look a lot different from UFC 1. So by the late 1990s, there were all these talented fighters in the UFC evolving the sport of MMA as we know it, but most of the public still saw it as a big joke. I think this shows it perfectly. In 1998, Joe Rogan was on Conan O'Brien's talk show talking about the UFC. I would say doing a good job in promoting it, but everyone just kept laughing at him.
You know, like the Ultimate Fighting Championship, you know, you got a referee, and if it gets out of hand, it's very safe. I mean, no one in all the...
People were clearly not taking it seriously, so by the 2000s, it was almost worthless and dangerously close to being shut down. So now, I'm going to start a new, much happier list for UFC fans that explains how they overcame these obstacles and transformed into the multi-billion-dollar, globally recognized success that they are today. For the first reason, I'm going to lump together all of the executives, mainly the Fertitta brothers and, of course, Dana White. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the UFC was sold in 2001 to the Fertitta brothers. Their family was involved in the Las Vegas casino business. Dana White was already managing UFC fighters. He had known Lorenzo Fertitta since they were kids, so he helped make that deal happen, received a minority stake in the company, and became the new president. It was under their control that UFC was able to grow, so keep in mind that they have been the main decision makers behind the rest of the reasons on my list. The next one being regulations. Clearly, these fights needed to be more regulated if they were going to be allowed to happen and allowed to be broadcast over television. So they really cracked down on it. In 2001, a unified set of rules for MMA was adopted by the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board, and in 2009, those rules were adopted by the Association of Boxing Commissions. Again, I don't want to get too specific here, but today, all of the UFC fights are legally sanctioned and regulated just like any other sport. New York was the final state to lift their ban in 2016, and everything has been legitimized. The changes were so effective that even John McCain himself expressed his approval of the UFC, and in a bit of a twist, Dana White has expressed his gratitude toward John McCain, saying, "I consider John McCain the guy who started UFC. If it wasn't for McCain, I wouldn't be here right now." So in the early 2000s, the UFC was successfully navigating through these legal issues, making their fights safer and more available, and even improving their reputation, but they were still struggling to attract an audience. By 2004, the numbers were still not looking good. The Fertitta brothers had invested nearly $40 million into the organization that was only pulling in about $14 million in sales per year. They were falling into debt, and the solution turned out to be the next reason on my list, the Ultimate Fighter TV show. I'm guessing that a lot of the viewers have seen this before. It's a popular show, but it's essentially a reality show where a bunch of fighters live in a house together and compete to win a UFC contract. And just listening to Dana White describe trying to get the show on the air, it almost seems like a miracle that it ever happened. They were rejected by all the networks except Spike TV, who also didn't seem to have all that much interest in the show. See, Spike was a new network, marketed to be the first network for men, so seemingly a perfect fit for the Ultimate Fighter, but they were showing more interest in this new crazy trampoline sport called Slam Ball, and only agreed to air the Ultimate Fighter if the USC paid to produce it. Well, as we now know, it turned out to be a big success, partially because it was on right after Monday Night Raw, but also because it featured some interesting coaches like Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture, and interesting contestants that viewers really grew to care about. The big Season 1 finale was their first non-pay-per-view live fight. It was between the finalists, and it did so well that I guess they agreed to make a second season directly after the fight in an alley behind the venue. And that was it. That was the spark for the big turnaround. The show and the finale exposed millions of people to the sport who had previously overlooked it or maybe didn't even know about it. Let me know if it's the case for you, but I remember this being the first time that I learned about UFC, and everything started exploding from there. Their revenue grew 12 times higher within 2 years, and everyone started talking about MMA in a much more respectful manner than before. My next reason behind their comeback is acquisitions, because right when they started gaining momentum, they were fast to capitalize on it by acquiring some of their most significant competitors. Notably, they bought World Fighting Alliance in 2006, Pride Fighting Championship championships the following year, that's a controversial one, and Strikeforce in 2011. Some of the advantages here is that these acquisitions reduce competition, help them gain more talent, and add to the backlog of previous fights in their library. It has gone so far that fighters have filed antitrust lawsuits against the UFC, claiming that their monopoly over MMA allows them to pay the fighters less money because there aren't any other organizations out there that can give competing offers. Leading me to my next reason behind the comeback, the fighters themselves. Obviously, so many talented fighters have been associated with the UFC over the years, but a few of them have really made their way into mainstream popularity and helped attract viewers to the fights. One that stands out, of course, would be Conor McGregor. I mean, he has been involved in some of the best-selling UFC events, including UFC 229, the best-selling one of all time, with 2.4 million people buying it on pay-per-view. Another obvious fighter would be Ronda Rousey, signing with the UFC as their first female fighter in 2013, and whether you like it or not, she briefly became one of the most famous athletes in the world. Unlike the 1990s, the UFC now has a reputation of having some of the best fighters in the world, many of which have big personalities that are entertaining to watch. Finally, to finish the list, the UFC has been heavily promoted in just about every way imaginable. In 2011, they signed a 7-year deal with Fox Sports to air the fights on their network and the Ultimate Fighter show on FX. Then, in 2018, they made a 5-year deal with ESPN. That's impressive. In the 1990s, cable companies refused to air the fights, even on pay-per-view, and now they are signing billion-dollar deals with these big cable channels. Aside from that, Electronic Arts publishes a popular UFC video game. There are more than 100 UFC gyms around the world. Joe Rogan continues to bring attention to it through his popular podcast, not to mention everything Dana White has been doing to personally promote it. So yeah, they have been getting the word out about UFC. It has fully transformed from an obscure underground organization into what I think we can call a global phenomenon. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about the UFC and how they were able to transform their business? Keep in mind that this is a wide subject, one of the biggest stories in sports over the past few decades that could easily be talked about for hours. Plenty of things that could be criticized, but also a lot to respect. So in this video, I did my best to stick to the aspects that involve their rise, fall, and rise again to give a general overview of their 30+ year history. So any thoughts you have about UFC or anything else you want to add to the conversation, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.